Maybe quick introductions for those who don't know us. I'm Heather Kingston, I'm a high school English teacher, and I work with teenagers all the time. I also have two teenage daughters, so I have a sophomore and I have a senior. So I get to look inside their brains 24/7 and see what's going on. So I have found this so helpful in understanding all their crazy behaviors. So we feel very passionate about sharing kind of all the learning that we have done around it. So we're so happy that you're here.
My name's Sue Ann Wallen. I'm an elementary school counselor, but I have to say most of my career I've worked with adolescents, and I worked in Canada and also abroad. But typically I worked with adolescents who had lived through trauma. So at that point I became very fascinated with the brain and how it works and how we develop resilience in young children and how that forms their brain development, or their brain development impacts them over a lifetime. So I continue to do research on it. We met each other last year just through friends talking, saying, you've got to meet Heather. You and she are talking about the exact same things, and it was really exciting. So the exciting thing was we actually just recently presented at NISA together a talk on executive function. And any elementary school parents know that I've done a lot of work with our staff and also with also done a lot of work on presenting around executive function in the brain. So this is an area we're very passionate about.
Yeah, and I think the other part for me is that when kids get to be teenagers, we expect them to be adults. So they're often treated like adults. And sometimes that breaks my heart because I know they're not adults yet, right? And we have to be very wary of how we do treat them because we're still helping them develop and grow. And so we don't want to miss those opportunities.
And I will say I also have an 11th grade daughter, so I'm right there with you. And the things that we talk about today, even though I know this stuff, I want it self-disclosure, I sometimes make the mistakes and I don't do the right thing. So I'm constantly reminding myself of the strategies and how to impart them.
So kind of our objectives for today is that our kind of first and foremost point is that you come from a place of empathy. Is that when you understand and you can walk in a teenager, adolescent's shoes, you're in a much better place to respond to things that you may not understand or why they're making the choices that they choose. So kind of starting with the empathy and then going in with some more skill, I guess, and understanding.
We want to give you that idea about, we've got the very basic, I use this brain actually in grade 2, and we talk about how that works, but we want to give you a very basic idea of, and we're not neuroscientists, but we certainly look at it, but we've got this teenage brain on your table, so we'll refer to that throughout the talk so that you're with us and understanding sort of those basic areas of the brain that are under development.
And then as we kind of explain the teenage brain, we'll be talking about building their resilience, their emotional resilience, so they're in a place to do their learning. Because the learning does not happen without having that emotional resilience. So we'll talk about how they connect.
Executive function skills are critical, and we know throughout a lifetime the development of those executive function skills begin in infancy and they continue to develop throughout a lifetime. So what are the ways that we can bolster that ability to plan and decide and make decisions and control our impulses? All of us are working on developing those executive function skills throughout a lifetime, but children that leave school with really strong executive function are able to survive in life much better and manage themselves much better. So
and then ultimately giving you some strategies to kind of move forward with that. So now that we have an understanding of the brain, we want to give you some practical strategies that will help with that.
We have embedded several videos inside the PowerPoint, which we'll share with you, so you'll have access to it. But this is something, Dan Siegel is kind of a guru for me, and the book that I've read most recently is called Brainstorm. Parents that are in the room from the elementary school, they know I'm a big proponent of the whole brain child. If you haven't, we've got that on our resource list at the end. If you haven't read any of the Dan Siegel books or seen his YouTube videos, he's phenomenal. So he's a researcher and a psychiatrist out of UCLA, and he really has studied that child and adolescent brain, and he really applies that to parenting. Really helps us to understand. So he's in this little kind of pictogram, he's talking you through that teenage brain and what's happening. So what we're going to be talking about today is that adolescent brain. And the cool thing about the adolescent brain right now, just a question for you. When someone says to you teenager or teen, what are the words that come to mind really quickly? The words that pop into your mind, yes.
Emotional.
Emotional. What are some other words that pop into your mind?
Moody.
Moody, yes.
Independent. Trying to be, that's, yeah.
Yeah, any other, sorry? Any other ones?
Rebellious.
Rebellious, great, yes. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes secretive.
Yes, sometimes secretive, absolutely, yes. What else? Courageous, yes, yes. Thank you. I love hearing these positive words. Throughout time, sometimes we've given teenagers a negative label. But what we've learned, and Dan Siegel talks about this in many of his talks, is that as a species, we would not have evolved if it weren't for the adolescent brain. So that risk-taking, that innovation, that mind that's courageous and independent, that's the reason we've evolved as a species. So if we can harness that energy in positive ways, then we really, and look at it from a place of optimism and health, then we can really help our children to develop. So the teenage brain right now is doing some amazing things. And what we want to explain to you, I want to give you this image. There's this myelination process that's happening where the brain is sort of coded. So it's creating superhighways or super connections in the brain. So it's an optimal place for learning, and it's an optimal place for growth. So it's super fast. But the other part, it's like Dr. Jensen, who will share another resource with you, who's done a lot of, Frances Jensen, done a lot of research around the teenage brain. She calls it, it's a Ferrari without brakes, or possibly a GPS at times. So super fast, those synaptic, connections are happening really quickly, but sometimes they don't have the ability to know when to stop or where to go. And so what she talks about is this idea of having a frontal lobe assist. The frontal lobe is that prefrontal part of the brain that makes good decisions. One of my least favorite things is when people say, oh, why can't they make good decisions? Well, because they're not always equipped to make good decisions. So we have to be that guide. We can't tell them what to do, but we have to be that guide on the side. The other part that happens in the adolescent brain, just really quickly, is this is a time of specialization. So before, when there's general knowledge that's happening and kids are learning in ways that are very, big ways, but you'll start to notice your adolescents finding their way, finding their path, finding their sense of who they are, and their specialization, they're doing something, the brain is doing something called pruning. So it's really, this is where I figure out who I am, what I'm good at, who my friends are, what's good for me in my life, where I'm headed, what I know. This is that time when that specialization occurs. And this is why we look at our plan now as the strategic mission goes ahead. We're looking at individualizing our educational plans for kids, because this is a period of great specialization for them.
So in the brain when it's developing, just so there's a clear understanding, when I talk about teenagers not being adults, the brain actually doesn't completely form until they're 25 years old. And so when you think about adolescents in middle school who are starting grade 6, grade 7, they're not even halfway there yet in their development, but sometimes we put those ideas on them. So the important kind of parts of the brain, just to point out, and the ones we'll be talking about, the amygdala is where all the emotions happen. So when you say that teenagers are moody and emotional, it's their amygdala. And so the amygdala is not quite developed yet. It's still developing. The second part is the prefrontal cortex. And in the prefrontal cortex, that's where all their decision-making is, and all their logic and reasoning and prioritizing and organizing. It all happens in the prefrontal cortex. But it's immature at this stage that they're in school. Here's the kind of thing we're really going to focus on. The amygdala takes control at this point because it's more developed than the prefrontal cortex. So when kids are trying to kind of figure out what to do, everything goes to the amygdala first. And then it's so fast, like it doesn't even get to the prefrontal cortex. The skills for making, it doesn't even get there, all the inputs. So it goes to the amygdala, your emotions take over, and that's what's making the decisions for them. So if we keep this in mind when our teenagers have these we're often like these big emotional responses, or like, calm down, it's not a big deal. Actually, it kind of is in their brain because their amygdala has taken over.
And the other thing I want to really talk about, and I want you to know, I did work with adolescents a long time, and what I found out was that I love this area. I want to start teaching kids in an early age. So in grade 2, we really talk about the PFC, and the kids get tired of hearing about these from Miss Wallen. Actually, they love it in grade 2. They're like, what are your calm down strategies. What do you do to work with your own nervous system to get yourself to a place where your amygdala isn't hijacking that prefrontal part of your brain? And when you're calm and you're ready to learn, you're in the green zone. So in grade 2, we call that the green zone. And I say, wow, check yourself right now. What zone are you in? Are you in an emotional state? Are you worried? Sad? So checking yourself, knowing where you're at, and then being able to adjust your response based on your own skills and strategies. So I'm always talking to kids about what do you do for yourself to help yourself calm down and help your nervous system be ready. One little thing I wanted to talk about is this hippocampus. And the hippocampus is like, if you think of an area that, this is the area of the brain, like it's your random storage, it's your access memory. So if you've had a negative experience early, sometimes that's stored in that area. And so that will trigger fear. So perhaps you've had a negative experience with a friend, or perhaps you've had a negative learning experience. When that's stored in that part of the brain, it can trigger fear. Relationships can also trigger fear. If they have a relationship that's volatile and it triggers fear, that amygdala will override. We will talk more in depth about what happens there, but we need to remember that the best way to work with our children is when they're in that prefrontal region. So the first assist that we must do is help our kids and ourselves actually get our nervous system in a place where we can communicate in that prefrontal part of our brain where we're making healthy decisions. And
Did you want to go to that?
there in the video embedded, Dan Siegel just gives you a quick hand model of the brain. It's something we teach the kids early, and we've taught them in high school as well, and it's that just showing them, here's that PFC, there's the amygdala inside, you have an experience, and suddenly you feel your emotions rising. We want to begin to recognize, oh, what are those cues? I feel unsafe, I feel unsettled. What do I do for myself to bring myself back online and get myself back to that PFC, or where that PFC is in charge? Parents have to do this too. Research tells us that neurons that fire together wire together. When we are stressed, they are stressed. So if we can really work on our own nervous system, we worry for our children. We're biologically hardwired to protect them. So sometimes that puts us into stress and amygdala override, and we have to figure out how do I bring myself back online and deal with things in that calm and rational way. Really, really important.
So kind of the direction we want to go is really talking a bit about the amygdala and how we can kind of calm down the amygdala and teenagers to help them so that we can access the prefrontal cortex. In the prefrontal cortex is where they are starting to form their identity. So when a child, when they're growing up and they form an identity, it builds resilience in them because they know who they are. They go through a lot of stages to get there. And teenagers, I had this great analogy. It was from author Josh Schiff, and he does a lot of teenage kind of resilience and emotion. And his analogy was, it's like you're on a roller coaster, and like you know how when you're on the roller coaster, you pull the bar down, and they click it in place, and you always check it to see if it's in place. Everybody does it to feel safe. So a teenager, when they push on you or they're emotional, they're hoping that you're the bar that's going to stay in place and not move. So when you don't move and everything's good, it adds to their identity because they're like, I'm safe, I can take more risks. I'm safe, I can take more risks. And they start developing who they are as individuals.
This place of identity formation is so critical. And for our kids that, I'll tell you, when we were at NISA, we saw, I would say it was about half an hour video, and it was filmed with international school kids from all over, and actually a couple were ASD kids, and they met in Seattle and they did this reunion, and they talked about what was most memorable for them about their learning experience in international, going to high school in an international school. And you guys, it wasn't about the subjects, it wasn't about the grades, it wasn't about what university they went to. It was none of those things that have made a difference to who they are today. And all these kids have been very successful. It really was about this stuff. It was about who am I? Where do I come from? Where do I belong? Who are my people? What they began to find out was, wow, I have this family of international friends. They came together, these kids, they didn't know each other. And yet they had all this stuff in common because they had this incredible life experience. They experienced grief. moving from place to place. They experience loss. They experience this wonderful, rich sense of like, wow, this is what the world has to offer. They experience all this cultural input that a lot of children don't have. And then they also experience a sense of loneliness, like, where do I come from? Where do I belong? And when they go to university, that not fitting in sometimes is a really big thing. So if we can really equip our kids with these identity formation pieces, knowing who I am internally, and when they're not relying on outside information, it really helps to give them build that resilience. So this was really critical to me. This is a beautiful film. It's about 8 minutes long. It's embedded, and we don't have time to show it to you today. It's called The Science of Character, and I'm always like, every time I watch it, I show it in grade 3, I show it to teenagers, I watch it myself just for inspiration. I know that's weird, but I love it because it talks about like, who are you as a person? We want to start filling our kids' buckets, not for what school they're going to, not for what their grades are. Who are you as a person? You are compassionate, you're creative, you're innovative. And we want our kids to begin to know these things about themselves. These are the internal attributes that drive identity formation. And so that's what we want to work on today.
So we'll kind of go to the amygdala and talk about the amygdala right now. So there's an understanding there. This is out of Harvard. They have a new, just started this year, I guess, mind-brain education science degree program, because this is an up-and-coming field in how we learn. And they have discovered that, like we've said, the prefrontal cortex, where the learning happens, does not function if you're stressed out, because the stress is what's called amygdala hijack, and your amygdala takes over and nothing else works. So they've done the research. They've got the data that goes behind it. So it's all about how do we get our kids' brains out of that stress so they can open up their prefrontal cortex to learn. So when I see like my kids in class, and I teach juniors and seniors right now, and I know they're stressed. So I do a lot of brain teaching to the kids. Every time I teach, I give them the brain science behind it. Whenever they're stressed out, I take their temperature in the room. If the stress is there, I can't teach them. At the very most, kids will take in 50% of what's being taught to them in class. 50% will go into long-term memory. If they're stressed, I'm lucky if it's 10%. So as a teacher, knowing that, I know I have to get them out of that mode of that amygdala hijack if they're going to learn what I need them to learn. If they're going to learn how to write an essay, it's not going to happen if they're stressed out. So I have to be, and I'm very transparent with that and with the kids and how I educate them. But it's always in the back of my mind when I'm teaching. I have to get their prefrontal cortex up front. So this is like, I love this diagram because it makes it very clear how this works. When you have any kind of visual or audio inputs, and we don't always know what those are for kids, like, audio might be they hear a whisper from someone and we maybe didn't hear it, or they see something and we don't know what it is. It's going to go to the thalamus. Your thalamus is like triage, and so it decides where that information is going to go. It has two places to go. It goes to the amygdala and it goes to the prefrontal cortex. Here's the problem. To get to the amygdala, it takes 30 milliseconds. To get to the prefrontal cortex, it takes 250 milliseconds. So all input goes to the amygdala first. If the amygdala senses that danger, then it takes over. And then that information never gets to the prefrontal cortex. Here, when you talk about teenagers being emotional, they are. They don't know why they're emotional. Like, I have my daughters, and they will cry. They're like, Mom, I don't know why I'm crying, right? Because whatever has triggered them, it's too much for them, and the emotion is in control. So it's really thinking about, how do I make sure that when it gets to the thalamus, that it gets to the prefrontal cortex as well?
So when the kids have tools in their toolbox to recognize that feeling or to get those early signals, that's what's really important. You as parents, first of all, we also need to recognize in ourselves when we feel we're triggered, because that helps us to understand them. But second, because, and again, their neurosystems feed off our neurosystems. I know this because I'm a counselor in a school. When you, and I say the kids that have the most sensitive neurosystems or who are hypervigilant to fear or danger, the kids that are more stressed, they show up on the barometer when the whole system is stressed. So perhaps you've got a week at school where there's a lot going on, there's exams, there's other things. The energy level in the school is going to be up here. Those kids with a really hypersensitive nervous system that are triggered easily are going to be much higher. So it's just recognizing that this too shall pass and say, okay, what can we do in this moment to really take care of ourselves and get that nervous system in a place where everybody's functioning sort of in a calm way. When everybody's in a frenzy in the family or in the household, this adds to that feeling of stress for the individual. And they're not always aware of it, as Heather was saying.
Yeah. And one fun fact, we have a candle here, so when you walked in, hopefully it smelled nice. When you have a smell input, it actually doesn't go to your thalamus, it goes directly to your amygdala. So calming smells, like they bypass and they calm your amygdala. So in my classroom, it always smells. When my kids have exams, I have this special Brazil nut spray that I put on their hands. They smell it. It's like they associate that calm with their test, so that it doesn't become highly stressed.
So the other important thing to remember about that with a hypervigilant brain, smell can also trigger fear. So if you think about your own personal experiences from your own childhood, from life experiences that you've had, smell, any sensory input can trigger the amygdala. So what we want to do is we want to be those sensory detectives to notice what triggers fear in ourselves and our children. So if they've had a negative experience, perhaps they had a teacher that was really hard on them, that wore a certain perfume. I had a kid one day, a high school kid, when I worked with kids that were trauma, who experienced a lot of trauma, and there was a rule in the school, no hats, and he was coming in from outside, and he was in Canada, so he was wearing a toque. And the high school teacher went to grab the hat off the kid's head, he's 17. And the first response to the kid was to punch this teacher in the jaw. So of course, we didn't deal, now I'm trained to deal with these kids, so I calmed him down. We didn't deal with it on the day. When we came back, we had a meeting with the principal, and we heard from the kid first, and he said, don't your teachers know that kids with post-traumatic stress disorder, you should never reach over a kid's head with post-traumatic stress disorder. I have been abused by so many males in my life. When someone reaches over my head, my first response is, boom, that amygdala triggered fear in him. And his first response was, protect myself. So think of that example when you think of what triggers fear in individuals. You might have your own fear triggers, but being aware of those is really, really critical.
So whatever that trigger is, of course, we don't always know for ourselves too. But there's usually something that has happened to trigger that response. Your body will respond, like if you have a panic attack, it's a body response to the trigger. Your body actually goes physically, it's like we have no control of it, it goes into survival mode. So it cuts down your oxygen, it cuts down your blood flow, because it has to conserve it to survive. And your body does that and you don't even know what's happening. But what that means is that it puts your body into a state of stress. And so that state of stress makes you have a behavior to survive. So in those behaviors after that trigger, everybody is different, which is kind of like, oh my goodness, like there's so many responses. How do you pay attention to them all? You note that I have a poster at the back and a poster at the front that you can look at more closely. But for ourselves and for our kids, there's 4 different responses to stress. So you can fight, right? So that's like, especially with kids, they'll get angry, they'll get defensive if you're trying to help them. My daughter, whenever she was stressed out, it would blow up into this fight. I'd be like, where's your passport? I don't know. And it would be like this big, huge fight. I'm like, I just wanted to know where your passport. But she was stressed about something totally different that I didn't know. So there is that kind of response. And we as parents often respond to that anger, not kind of internalizing that it's a response to stress. There is flight. So it's like kind of over-worrying, not being able to relax. Kind of like the one behavior my daughter will have is obsessive compulsive. So it's like I can't control the stressful situation, so I will find something, I'll get away from that, so I'll find something I can control. For her, it was making her bed 10 times. And that kind of gave me that information.
These are also kids that run away. So they're the young children that flee. So flee, it's not being non-compliant, it's actually a fear response. So for younger children that run away to seek safety, it's very much a natural human response to
And the other part with students too is overachieving. Overachieving is running away from the fear behind them, right? It's like, I have to be better, I have to be better, I have to be better. Because if I stop, I don't know what's going to happen. So we see a lot of our kids in that mode. We have freeze. That's kind of the spacing out. That's the, I'll do my homework later. I'm going to play some video games first. I'm going to talk. I'm going to be on my phone. I'm going to be on my laptop watching YouTube videos. It's sort of that I just need to go into this cave because I can't handle what's outside of me. And those, again, are the behaviors that we often get frustrated with those kids because we think they don't care. It actually is because they're having, we don't know what the trigger is, right? But we have to be open to try and find out what that trigger is. And then the last one is fawn, and it's kind of that people-pleasing, trying to be the nice one, like not creating conflict, always being lovely to everyone, not kind of giving their voice attention. They just want to make sure that everyone is happy and there will be no stress, right? And there's adults who do the same, right? Like we have that. But there's so many different ways that stress plays out with adolescents and children.
And remember that these are the ones that we often respond to. And then these ones are more the ones, particularly this one, that we miss. So that's internalized stress. And I always worry a little bit more, that's those introverted kids, that the kids that tend to internalize and really take it on, and they're people pleasers just to avoid conflict. They're the conflict avoiders. We might even see that in ourselves. But again, how do we actually learn how to develop the skills to kind of work through and notice when we're kind of going into that place? And we talk a lot of, we could give a whole other talk on mental health for adolescents, but this really ties in so closely with building resilience around mental health and knowing your triggers and knowing who you are.
Are you okay we play this one?
Sure.
This video, I show this to all my students about neuroplasticity. They need to understand their own brain, so when I speak to them, we have a shared language. But it helps for parents because this is, as we move forward into strategies, this is what we're trying to do. And I'll tell you, which is very interesting, there's a whole line of these brain videos from Centis. Centis is actually a securities company, and they go to corporations and they train people on being safe in the business place, but they've made these fabulous brain videos that they help train, which is fascinating to me. But this one is such a great visual for ourselves and for our kids.
Let's check the volume here.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
So one of the most important things about this video is just thinking about this idea that thinking about how you think about yourself can be rewired. And this is one of the ways that we can create that sense of resilience. So how children think about themselves, sometimes we need to change those pathways in the brain. And that's where that identity formation comes in. But the other thing that we wanted to mention is, in Frances Jensen's book, she talks a lot about this. per more recent, and we only have the brain research within the last, say, 10 years and even 5 years to really kind of promote these ideas, but we used to think that intellect was static. And now we know intellect is not static. So during adolescence, in her study, she's found that for some kids, she could see, say, a third of the kids roughly, they could see an increase in IQ. And so those kids had these more adaptive features. For some kids, they stayed steady, and their IQ didn't change. Now, for kids that were in that bottom third, sometimes IQ can be decreased, and that can be coming from stress. That can be coming from traumatic experiences. Now, it's not to say that those pathways can't be rewired. That's also a time where we say that substance use or maladaptive coping mechanisms can really harm that brain growth. So it's not harping on our kids about the fact that substance use is part of their life or these risky behaviors. It's really more about helping them to have more adaptive skills. What they're doing is using maladaptive ways of coping with stress. And so when we can give them more adaptive tools, then we don't see those. So it's really switching our lens and helping them switch their lens around. What do they do to self-calm? Most substance use is a self-calming tool. So for any child, no child wants to be using substances, but they use them to really calm their nervous system. Many of us do, and we can probably talk about that for another day too.
Yeah, and I think one of my biggest fears is always self-medication with adolescents. It's out there, we know it's out there, we know it's happening with targets. And it's thinking about...
Many scientists believe that the brain did not.
Why are they doing it? Like, what are they responding to? Are they responding to stress and trying to find... These are easy ways, right? These adaptive ways of self-medication. They're the easy way. And it's been accepted as a cool way of kind of helping yourself adapt to the stress. So we have to teach the kids about their brain. So when I talk to my kids, they're like, oh, Mom, not the brain again. But I'm like, this is your neural connection. So for some reason, you've chosen this adaptive way to deal with it. We want to change that neural connection. And if the kids understand that and see it, then you're in a great place to go, okay, I want to help you with that. I want to give you a strategy to help with that. Now, the thing with the neuroplasticity too, just before we get to the strategies, is that Sue-Ann alluded to the myelination. So in a neural connection, we saw in that video, it gets thicker. It's actually your body's process. It's protein and fat come together. Every time you have a neural connection, an electrical connection, that protein and fat wraps that connection to make it thicker. So in order for it to be a habit, you have to do it quite a few times so it becomes a habit. So we often will say to kids, I told you once. What? I told you twice. I told you 3 times. To myelinate that connection, it takes a lot more than 3 times. Frustrating for us, time-consuming, yes, but we have to keep that in our mind. And if we want them to myelinate that good connection, we have to put the time in to support them.
So, and that is 12 to 30 repetitions. So if we're working with our teenagers, and I learned a lot just from the teenagers I've worked with in the past. They teach me more than I've ever taught them probably. But if we're practicing this together, so we're kind of like, I'm practicing changing my behavior because I'm not responding to you in the same way that you're, I'm not reacting to you the way that you're responding. So I'm doing this work alongside you, we're helping to reformat that brain. And again, if I go back to working with teens and trauma, I'm 5 feet tall, little small me. I used to work with, a lot of kids, young males who'd been incarcerated who were really angry. I'd had, and they would come to my room and things would get wrecked and ruined. But I would be able to bring a child from anger to tears very, very quickly. It wasn't by getting bigger and stronger, and it wasn't by getting punitive. It's very simple. And I had this, it was just this thing. I would just get low and slow and be like, wow. And then immediately tears, and I'd be like, yeah, can you put your hands on my hands, or just put your hand on your heart. Notice how fast your heart's beating. It's that really, really checking in and having that empathy in that moment when they're having that emotional over-response to something, and helping to and not only that, if it's been a traumatic experience, every interaction with an adult has been negative, or the majority of them, I have to pattern that enough times that they have a trusting relationship with me so that they will come back to me in those moments of total fear or total fallout, right? So this is really important. This is why strategy number 1 is critical. And if I go back to the hat example, connect before you direct. This is not, and I want to stop just for a minute and pause because parenting is the hardest job in the world, so I want to validate everyone in the room. Because we forget this stuff. We are living in a time where it's very difficult to parent children. We're living in a time where they're constantly, instantly gratified, and so that it's way harder to develop that self-control piece. We're living in a time where we're all flooded with too much information. We're all too busy and too stressed. So this is a very difficult time to be parenting teenagers. So I don't want to take that away from you. But sometimes we forget we're directing our kids all day long. They go from lesson, just to classes, to this, and we're shouting at them all the time. And we're forgetting to do that connection piece. And it's interesting, I talked recently with a group of third graders about why they're having such trouble listening to each other. And what they came up with, nobody's listening to us. They're telling us what to do all the time. Or when we try to talk to someone, they're distracted. They're on a computer, they're on a phone. People aren't listening. So we practice this knee-to-knee, eye-to-eye. We sat with each other, facial eye contact, which again stimulates those neuroconnections. Gentle touch. How are you today? Tell me what's going on. Taking that time to really connect before we throw out that direction or that directive, that thing we want them to do. Hey, I wonder how your day was. Even being a little bit saying, hey, my day was hard. How was your day? Getting down to their level. That connection before direction cultivates the sense of I'm being seen, I'm being understood, I'm being heard. And it reinforces those synaptic connections in the brain.
So strategy 1 is connect before you direct. So as they are sharing what's going on and you're giving them that safe space, then it's like validating their emotions. If they're going to make themselves vulnerable and say, you know what, I had a crappy day or whatever it is that they say, then you need there to hear it and validate it because it's okay for them to be upset. It's okay for them to be angry because this is all about calming the amygdala. So you can get to a place where they can do the logical reasoning and decision making. So you want them, they want to feel heard so that they're like, oh, actually, I can say my words and they have power. They want to feel safe so they can be vulnerable in those moments. And they want to feel soothed, that someone is going to be there to give me a hug when I need that hug or whatever day that might be. Sometimes you're in a rush and it's hard to always do that, but that's kind of what they're looking for, to kind of bring that amygdala under control.
Eye contact is essential, and it's something I try and build into every lesson. I don't when I come into the classroom, I do it really intentionally, and it's this kind of like, okay, you can come to the carpet once you've looked into my eyes, and I give a big smile. Again, we have smile neurons in our brain so that we can actually trigger those feelings of warmth and connection just with a smile and a gentle touch, and that really, really intense eye contact, so super important.
And the funny thing is, too, I can bring seniors to the carpet, and they're just as happy to do that. I'll sit down, let's just chat. Like, I've got these 18-year-old men with beards, but they want to sit on the carpet and they want to share. So it works, it doesn't matter the age, they all want to do that.
Just, if we can go back just to slide 2 just for a sec, I want to, this soothing one is really important. Our kids need 8 hugs a day, and that's research driven. A lot of kids now are coming to school with kind of what we call sensory processing or sensory integration issues, because they're not having enough of the kinds of things that human beings actually need. So that is pushing and pulling, squishing, climbing, connection to nature. All of our senses are not, they're not getting enough sensory input. Partially Dubai. It's partially the world we're living in today. So when that is what's soothing to adults. If we think about what's soothing to ourselves, they're often things that it doesn't involve talking. It involves those sensory kinds of things. So be a sensory detective and notice what's soothing for your child. And I always give this example of my daughter. She as a kid, she would build herself a fort with all her pillows and things like that. When she's stressed today, she'll do the same thing. She'll be like, nest in her cave, which I call it the cave. She's got every pillow, every blanket in the house, and she makes a big nest, and that makes her feel comfortable and soothed. So again, what do we do for our kids neurobiologically to soothe that nervous system? Notice your kids. Notice what soothes them. Each child's really different. We're different. Notice what soothes yourself. This stuff doesn't just work with our teenagers, it works with our partners too. Notice what soothes your partner. How can you also have that same kind of thing?
You know, and funny, my daughter's a senior and she was in prom on Thursday night. And then Friday I was watching TV and she crawled up, got under the blanket, put her head on my lap. She said, Mom, play with my hair. Because I was ready to nose down. In my head, I'm like, you're 18. And I have to go back and go, she needs it. Like, she just needs to do that.
And if you remember that brain, that's a positive memory that's stored, right? That's in that hippocampus. It's there. It's somewhere very well beneath the layers. And we have to help our kids to figure out what those are for them. This is a big one. Be curious, not furious. I can't remember which book or who put, I'd love to credit the person. This is this idea of before we get mad or before we react, to just find out, get all the pieces of the puzzle first. And as a parent, we have to do this. You know, figure it out a little bit. Our teenagers' perception is very different from our own. In fact, everybody's perception is different from our own. So check for yourself what's going on with them and what's going on with the situation. Because we just need to be curious and find out what's going on for them first. It's like, hey, that didn't go well. I wonder why. Tell me more about this. If we get mad first, what does that do? Fear, response. You also get shut down. Most likely you're going to get shut down. Are they going to listen to you next time? Probably not. Are they going to want to problem solve with you? Absolutely not. The next time something really, really serious happens, will they come and talk to you? They will probably talk to a friend. Will that friend give them the advice that the same strength you would, or the same positive advice you would? Probably not. Really, really important. Harsh consequences, we've learned, are not effective. They only create an environment of fear. We like to think of it as reteaching. So we want to pre-teach and we want to reteach. So we want to get in front of situations. If your kid always is stressed at these things, you're going to get in front of it and say, wow, I remember last time that test came, it was really hard for you. What do you think we could do to make it easier for you next time? Or how can we help to get you prepared? Notice I'm asking, I'm not telling. I'm not saying you need to study. Work harder. That doesn't work. And we know that harsh consequences really are very detrimental to the brain. Shaming is also very detrimental to the brain. That is that identity formation. Do we want our kids to have an identity of shame, embarrassment, fear, or do we want them to have that identity of like confidence and willing to risk, safe to risk? So we want to think about each time that we respond, even if there's a mistake that seems unforgivable.
And I think the other point too, when we talk to teachers as well, because they're with their kids all the time. So they need to understand this too, so they're not responding with anger or with shame. They still need to have those same responses to the kids.
I always tell parents anger is a secondary emotion, so think about when your child has an angry response, think about what drives the anger. Is it fear? Is it shame? Is it embarrassment? Is it worry? What is the thing? Is it jealousy? What do you think is peel back the layers a little bit. Try and be that investigator that's finding out what's causing that emotional response. Your kids might not know either.
And the one thing I wanted to add in here, because it is kind of something we've all sort of grown up with and we're trying to change it, is that failing is good. And so I teach the kids that fail actually stands for first attempt at learning. So it's okay. It's okay to make those mistakes because then we're going to figure out how to learn from them. And I think as parents too, we want to remember that. This is a learning opportunity. And we're thinking about the neural connections. How do I help them myelinate the right connection to have success instead of feeling that shame from having failure?
I want us to have a little bit of a mind shift around things, and this we talk a lot about internal validation and external validation. And what we're seeing with our youth today, and we don't have time to talk about technology, is they're constantly seeking validation from their device. They're connecting through their devices. We know that, right? And there's nothing we can do to change that. But when they're constantly seeking external validation to fill them up, that is a bottomless pit. So the number of likes they get on their Instagram, the number of likes they get on their social media, that is a bottomless pit. That's not what builds confidence. So we need to really figure out what is motivating them internally. What makes them feel good about themselves? Do they feel good about themselves because they're really fit, or do they feel good about themselves because they won the award? It's not about winning the award. You know what? It's just not about winning the award. It's not about getting into the best university. It's not about getting the highest grades. The grades are irrelevant. Our children, we know that Malcolm Gladwell's written in his book, Outliers, he talks about it. You know what? Your kids that get on the honor roll, they're typically born between January and March. They're typically firstborns. You know, all those things are advantages. They're coming from two-parent families. They don't have trauma in their lives. Kids who are winning awards constantly, they're already getting all that internal validation because they already have all that stuff they need in their toolkit. So how do we internally reward each of our kids to go, what makes you really cool and really unique? Oh, you know what? You're not the top grade earner. You're amazing because you're super innovative and you're going to do something amazing with that one day. We've got to push away this desire to compare our kids, and also we have to really stop thinking about rewarding those awards and grades and all those external motivators. And I'm sorry because we do live in a system that externally rewards kids, but how do they internally reward themselves for the great things that they do have? There's where you're going to get non-fear of failure, is when we can do that really well.
So now it's sort of that next step. So if we can get that amygdala under control, and it's not controlling them, it's like now we want to focus on the prefrontal cortex where the learning is happening, decision making is happening. So in your prefrontal cortex, which remember is developing a little slower than the amygdala, that's where kind of all this stuff we want our kids to do is. That's where it lives. So it's things about, doing critical thinking, complex and challenging, inhibiting behaviors, understanding behaviors and stopping them, forming strategies, planning, organizing, like things like getting your homework done ahead of time, studying for it. All of that stuff that we want to see in our kids, once the amygdala is under control, then they're in a better position and we can access the prefrontal cortex.
We live in a go, go, go world right now, and one of the big things I'm trying to really work with younger kids in doing is this stop, think about it, and then go. We live in a world that's like instantly gratified, constantly. They can get information. So I want you to stop and just think about it, visualize it. It's really hard for them to do. That's where this mindfulness piece of this mindfulness movement is really coming from. We want kids to be present in the moment. They've got all this information that's flooding their synapse, and it's too much, it's overload. So we want them to do that stop, think about it, and then go. The stop, think about it, go is the roots of inhibitory control. I have to think about it. How could this go? How might that play out? We really want to plant those seeds. We don't just want to go, go, go. So it's taking the time to just, okay, before you say something, I want you to stop and think about what you're going to say. And we have to do the same. Before we have a response, maybe we want to stop, think about how it will be received, and then go. It's, even with sending emails and that sort of thing, and messages, we're really working with our kids to think about stop, think about it before you press send. They're really quickly doing that. And now we know it really puts them at risk, particularly with taking photographs and sharing information on their devices. Stop, think, and then go.
So there's a lot more to it, but in an executive function, it's basically the skills you need to execute. That's all it is. And we all have a certain level of development in those areas. So it's narrowed down, and this is all based on brain science. They've been able to find those connections. And it's basically your brain as an air traffic controller. It's like when whatever input goes into your brain, you have to know which buttons to, that information's coming in, information's going out. You need to know how to manage it as an air traffic controller. If you don't have the right buttons to push, things might crash, right? And so teenagers haven't developed it yet. They won't develop those skills. And some adults don't, let's be honest. They won't fully develop those until 25. And those are the skills we want to focus on as we can access that prefrontal cortex. So there's inhibitory control, which is when those emotions happen from your amygdala, how you control them. Your working memory is basically how do you hold pieces of information in your head and use them. And it could be anything from the classroom or to home. Can you, after you get home, take out the dog, do the dishes, and do your homework? You take out the garbage, and the rest is gone. You're like, oh my God, like I told you 3 times. But if you're working memory, it's like a table. Your brain can only hold, like everybody's table, it's a different size. So maybe you can hold 2 pieces of information Some people can hold 5, some people can only hold 1. And so for kids developing, we don't know the size of their table. From experience, I can look at kids and go, I know that's a working memory problem because they can't follow my instructions. So I do that. But at home, one of my daughters, their table's huge. My other daughter, not so much, right? So I can't expect my one daughter to be the same as my other daughter. But it's just being aware that it's developing. Like we want to help them try and figure out their memory.
We also know working memory is impacted by stress. So we have to be really conscious of that size of the table is moving. So they might have a great working memory if the stress is low. But if they have a low stress tolerance, then that working memory is not there. So you'll say, those are the kids that are like, I studied it and then I got to the test and I went blank. Because their anxiety, the amygdala, the fear took over. It's like, and they've got that negative message in their head saying, I'm not going to do well, I can't do this, it's so hard. And we really want to work to strengthen that working table so that they can hold more information and believe that they can do it, right? So part of that's fear related as well.
And then the last one is cognitive flexibility. So it means that you can go between different ideas, adapt to change. Some kids are quite good at it, and they can go back and forth. You have a test, we change the date. Some kids are okay with that, some are not. My girls, Mom, you said we're going shopping on the weekend, and then I changed it. One can deal with it, one cannot deal with it. So it's being sensitive to that, because if they haven't developed the cognitive flexibility, it will trigger their amygdala. So it's just being aware that they aren't being difficult, they're developing the cognitive flexibility.
And just to remember, like when we talk at our school about future-ready skills, all the content stuff is available to our kids. When they have this stuff really deeply embedded and this stuff is working for them, this is what helps them to be successful in the future. This is when they can communicate and collaborate with their colleagues. This is when they can hold on to information and remember it and be able to use it in productive ways. This is when they can stop and think before they act. So these are the soft skills that make our kids successful in the future. This is what they're going to need as young adults. The information that they're getting, the content they're getting, that's ever changing. That's always accessible to them. This stuff is stuff we have to keep working on and building.
And when we talk about the empathy part, like if I'm sitting in a meeting with my colleagues, like a staff meeting, whatever, and I'm working with them, I'm quietly, secretly assessing their executive function skills because I can read them and then I can respond to them. So it works with adults too, kind of thinking about if someone is not responding the way you want, maybe think about their executive function. So for students, really what this means is that these are the skills that they're developing. And these are everything we want teenagers and young adults moving into university to be able to do, so they're independent. So with that in mind, now it's like we've calm strategies for calming the amygdala, now the strategies for developing that prefrontal cortex.
Just so you know, I quickly made a refrigerator card for you, or a pocket card, just so you can remember. I know when I meet with parents, a lot of the times they're like, what did you just say? I need to write that down. So I gave a few little starter quotes. It's very quickly done, but they're little survival tips at your table. I could probably made a group of 10 things, but I came up with 7 that I felt would be helpful to take away with you. But the number 4 is name it to tame it. And if you get back to Dan Siegel's work, it's like when we can name our emotions, we can tame them. So it's this idea of tell me how you're feeling. How did that make you feel when that happened? Instead of, again, you want to be curious, not furious. So you kind of want to get back to that asking, not telling. How did it make you feel when so-and-so said this to you? Or how was your, how did it make you feel when you were left out or when you didn't do well or whatever that was? So we're asking them to name their feelings. That is the beginning stages of recognizing their own emotional self-control. So when they can name their emotions, they're able to, that's what it's going to stop that quick hijack of the amygdala, right? So naming the emotions is probably very critical. So giving them a wide vocabulary. Well, I feel frustrated. I felt really hurt. I felt left out. I felt excluded. I feel lonely. I love doing this. Grade 2s and 3s love this stuff. They can do it. And this is pretty much a lot of the content. How did you feel when that happened? How might the other person feel? And this also gives them the roots of empathy. So if they understand how they feel, they can understand how someone else feels. Remember, if we've had an experience, it's much easier for us to empathize with another person. So we want to be able to name it to tame it. So We want to name the emotion. We want to validate the emotion. And that's really back to that number 2 strategy. Once you've named the emotion, you want to say, wow, that must have been really hard. It must have felt really bad when that happened. Think about yourselves right now when you come home and you've had a hard day. Or you've been at home with the children, you've had a really hard day. What is the most helpful thing that someone can say or do in that moment? Just think about that. And then, is there anyone that has an idea? What would be helpful to you at the end of the day? Yes. Non-judgment. Instinctual thing, if we're worried, we might jump from that, right? Or we might say, oh, we might. So again, and these are the kind of things that work in all of our relationships, but particularly our adolescents who are extra sensitive. My daughter and I have an agreement. We don't even talk in the car on the way home from school. We're not allowed to. We listen to music. She's the DJ, and it is the most lovely time we have together. We do not talk. And if I start talking about something, she'd be like, like, I broke the non-talking rule. And she just loves me to listen to her music. And we're connecting through the music. And it's just this lovely, peaceful time. So it's that name it to tame it, noticing how we feel, and then assessing how they are and letting them be their own advocate in those situations. Such an important strategy. This develops that prefrontal part of the brain. These strategies actually build that part of the brain.
And it's not only emotional, but cognitive too. Have them name the struggles that they're having when they're trying to figure out. They're doing math. Like, I don't know how to do it. I'm like, which piece do I know? I don't know. You have to kind of give them, is it adding the numbers together? Is it division? Is it writing them? You have to really be specific and having them name their cognitive process as well. And then once they're metacognitive and they can think about their thinking, they have control. They have strength. And that will help their prefrontal cortex develop.
All of this idea of metacognition and thinking about your thinking is really a huge part of Dan Siegel's book called Brainstorm. We'll share it at the end. He also wrote another book called Mindsight. It's being aware of our thoughts and our processes. And I guess it's interesting for me, last week there was a talk on AI or artificial intelligence. I'm really passionate about this idea that as AI comes into play, that's a lot of our information out there, right? We have to increase our own emotional intelligence and our own social intelligence at the same rate as artificial intelligence. Otherwise, people are going to be making decisions for us that we are not able to make for ourselves. So we really want to do this for our kids so that they can be consumers and make decisions that are best for them and not be told what to do by devices and the artificial intelligence. So we want to build that prefrontal part of the brain. We don't want to give it away. Think about how many of us are using that part of our brain now to do things like we're relying on our artificial intelligence to do a lot of stuff. So then we're not building that prefrontal part of the brain and building those metacognitive skills if we're not practicing it constantly. So this is really an important thing to me.
And it's interesting with my teens, like when I'm teaching them, I'm like, what's the most complicated piece of machinery? So they're like trying to come up with everything, come up with these names. And someone always says artificial intelligence. I'm like, yeah, artificial intelligence is trying to replicate the most complex piece of machinery in the world, which is your brain. Who has an instruction manual for that in here? We don't have one. And it's like, we do now, actually. We do have an instruction manual now. So let's try and figure out that piece of machinery, and we're in a good place for the artificial intelligence.
So we've kind of talked about this a lot, and I know we're coming almost to, we've got a few minutes left, but this is an ask, don't tell. This is just always remembering to ask the question before we tell what to do. And again, this is when we tell kids what to do, we kind of take away their opportunity to figure out what to do. So even though we might know the answer or what might something work for us, it doesn't matter. Resist the urge to give advice, resist the urge to tell what to do. And I always say this as a counselor, one of the hardest things for me. As parents, we want to fix it. And as counselors, you always want to fix and help people and that sort of thing. But the hardest thing that I had to learn was to really step back and let people do their own learning and come to their own conclusions about themselves. I don't have the answers about anyone, their children, or their families. We have the answers about ourselves and our families. And my job is to help you come to that. So your job as a parent is to help your kids know themselves better. I'll sit with kids as young as 7. They can tell me about how they are as a learner, what they need as a person, what they need as a friend. Ask your kids what they need. Ask them to do that work. If we do it for them, we take it away from their opportunity to learn.
And a little coaching tip, and this works, someone told me that, I'm like, no, it doesn't, but it does. If you ask a question and they say, I don't know, then you respond with, but if you did know, what might the answer be? Because it takes the fear away from the answering. And they always come up with the answer. So I can talk to any kid, I don't know. I'm like, okay, but if you did know, and they blah, 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 and it comes out. So you don't even have to like respond to the I don't know. Just go back to them again when it feels safe to respond.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier too, like sometimes nonverbals are really, really important. So just holding space with your kids or being together and doing something you enjoy together can really just allow them to begin talking. When we're over asking, that sometimes shuts them down. So find that thing it is that you share that allows them to feel most vulnerable with you in that moment, and guaranteed they will just start talking. And I've worked with kids with really intense issues where they're like, can I just come and sit with you in your office? And I'm like, okay. And I had a girl who's like so terrified and really had some serious concerns. And she's like, if I sit under the table, I just don't want to see anyone. And I'm like, it's okay. And like half an hour later, she just came out and she told me this big long story. But she needed that time to really process her thinking and to feel safe and cocoon. She was able to tell me all these things about herself that were really important for me to know. So I didn't have to ask, I had to let her lead.
And so kind of this sort of a little bit two-part, the strategy 6, you're going to ask the questions, you have to be ready to listen and actively listen. And as parents, sometimes that can be really hard because we have sort of already have the answer in our head that we're looking for. So it kind of puts it off. You have your own agenda. We all do as parents, right? We know where we want them to go. You might be uncomfortable if your child is uncomfortable. So if they're crying, you might want to just say, there, it's okay. You still need to have that time to share and for you to listen. You might not like the answer they give you. Right? Some of them respond, and you're like, I don't know the response to that. And you don't have to know, right? You don't have to have the answers, but you do have to listen to what they're saying. And then sometimes your amygdala goes into
And I want to go back to something you said earlier as well. It's that non-judgment. Our kids are really fearful of being judged by us and other people, particularly as adolescents. So if we can take the judgment out of it, they'll tell us anything if we don't judge them. And that's the really important, because the biggest things they need to tell us are the hardest things. And if we have a preconceived idea or a judgment about us, they're not going to tell us. That's going to distance them. So we have to be willing to hear the difficult stuff. And again, I go back to grade 3, we did the knee-to-knee, eye-to-eye exercise. And the way the exercise works, I'm like, okay, you're going to sit across from your friend, your partner, and you're going to talk. And they're like, oh, I'm so excited to get booked. And I said, but partner A talks, partner B is not allowed to talk at all. No words. And they're like, what? That's impossible. There's no way I can't not talk. And I said, yeah, because you're all talking. So they had to do it and they had to practice it. Sometimes it takes practice to get that. Listening without talking.
Yeah, so when you are listening, just kind of be quiet and calm and take it in, and don't try not to react when they are telling you what they want, and then give them the space to do that. Like, give them the time. Sometimes we want to have they want to have, that's the point. They want to have the big conversations when you're running out the door, right, or when you're really fast. But that's kind of them on the roller coaster pushing the button. They're looking for you to make that time. And I know my kids sometimes do it on purpose. Because then the turnaround for me is like, so you don't really want to hear what I have to say. I actually really do, but I have a job that starts at 8:15, so yeah. But, you have to make that time for them so they feel. So your phone's not there, your laptop's not there, right? Everything is put down so they know it's just that time.
Reading the cues is so important, and again, it's being that observer and knowing when is the right time and how. And sometimes they're not telling you something with their words. They're going to tell you something with their body language or their eyes or So it's just like, I don't know about you, but my mom still at her age can look at me, hear my voice, and know how I'm doing. And I think that's a really cool thing, just to be able to read those cues. And still at my age, my mom can really know that about me. I think that's wonderful.
And then also remember that just be your best you, right? Kids are watching you all the time, even when you don't think they are. So it's kind of like if you model behaviors, if you kind of name and tame your emotions, if you talk about the way you figure out problems, the way you plan, if you model that in front of them, even without telling them, they'll watch you. And we know that, like when your kid first swears, pretty sure it's from my husband. But they are watching you and they see those, and it still happens even as teenagers and adolescents. They're still watching. So kind of model how you want them. We were talking about like when you yell at your kids, right? You're like, don't yell at me. And you're yelling at them. It's like, oh yeah, that doesn't really. So it's kind of modeling.
Why are you talking to me that way? It's just like, oh, I have to remind myself that.
And then there's a lot of research coming out for university now, because remember the kids are going to university and the brain's not developed yet, but we're expecting them to live an adult life in university. And so more and more we're hearing about mental health issues. These kids are dropping out. There's a lot of stuff going on. So trying to develop these skills now and really helping them is really going to help them be successful, especially with our cohort and dynamic of kids. They are going off. Many, like mine, is going off to a different country, and I'll be here. And that scares me to death. I'm hoping she has the skills. I'm hoping I'm still there to help. But we need to kind of think about it now, so we are giving them those skills to help.
And I'm hoping that, here's just a few reads to get you started, but we're hoping that we've given you just a little bit of information. Honestly, we could, out of that talk, there's several more talks. We did put you at tables today so that you could sort of be with other people and have that sense of community. Know that parenting is not a perfect science and that we're all learning through it together. And I guess part of our wanting to do talks is to really build that sense of community so that we're really helping each other in those kind of really careful and helping each other's children as well in those careful, non-judgmental ways. We're trying to learn with all our children alongside you, and to develop these skills and these capacities so they can be successful in the future. So we want to do that work together as a community and support each other. So if you have questions or you want to chat with us, you're welcome to. We really enjoy the topic and
We'll talk about it forever.
talk about it all day long. So, yeah. But we thank you so much for coming, and we really do want to build community around these ideas. So if there's any questions or you want to stay around, you're welcome to. But thank you.